necessarily just about technology, it's also about the teams and the people that make up the technology.
Something so different. Something so different.
I work for Kili, IO, Commerce Space Inc. We're a global cloud computing company, startup, sorry. Yeah, and basically use OpenStack to deploy our infrastructure service. Yeah, and our servers are hosted locally. So anyway, aside from that, today I'm going to talk about Ansible. And Ansible is what we call an IT orchestration and configuration management tool, a set of tools. Sorry. Let's go to the next slide. So where does the name come from? In science fiction, Ansible is the name you give to a device that allows or facilitates instantaneous communication regardless of distance between you and your peer on the other side, without any delay or latency whatsoever. So, in real life, Ansible is a radically simple IT orchestration engine, just like I said, and configuration management. So what are those? Those are big words I just said right now. So, orchestration is actually a sequence of events that you execute in order to get your infrastructure in a desired state. So let's say you wanted to deploy web servers, or maybe a WordPress site to one of your servers somewhere. You would need to install Apache, maybe, or Nginx if you prefer, MySQL database, PHP, and WordPress itself. So one way of doing this is basically connect a monitor and a keyboard to your server and apt-get install all those until it gets to the state that you would like it to be. So that gets kind of complicated when you scale out, when you have multiple servers, and when you want to do things, crazy things like load balancing, and yeah, things like this. So it would be crazy to go to each and every one of those servers and apt-get install XYZ. It would take you months to complete. So we have tools that facilitate that. So the next big word that I mentioned was configuration management, which is.
So anyone else that hasn't copied the stuff? You guys see that? Anyone else that hasn't copied the stuff or was on the flash drive?
Okay, so moving on swiftly. So configuration management is a set of practices geared towards managing desired state and handling changes on your infrastructure. So let's say you want to do a set of upgrades to the previously mentioned WordPress install for web servers. You want to manage that state and keep all your servers in a consistent state. So that's the science of configuration management. Okay, so I get how Ansible works. Basically, in this way I can explain, Ansible requires a single node where you be connecting to your managed nodes from via SSH in order to execute your implement or manage the state of your managed node. That makes sense. So basically what Ansible does is SSHs to each and every one of the servers you do manually and does all you want to do manually on those servers. Maybe following a script, which you call playbooks, we look at those later. So Ansible's dependencies. So Ansible, like I said before, in order to work with Ansible, you need 2 hosts, at least minimum. One is your control machine, where you'll be running your Ansible scripts from, or your commands from, and just down a bit. Down. And your managed node. This is actually, in this case, your web server, where you want to deploy your WordPress stuff. So back up again. So Ansible is mostly written in Python, and it's mostly written in Python 2. Not Python 3, they have not yet switched. So still, Python 3 is still good. So it also depends on Python YAML. This is YAML is a templating, sorry, is a markup language, and this is what basically Ansible uses to format its playbooks. Playbooks are actually scripts that are followed by Ansible in order to install all the packages or manage your configuration state of your managed nodes. Ginger, for those of us who are familiar with Django, is a templating engine. This allows you to have minimal programming like features in files that you need to process and pass in order to get the final copy or final state of the file that you need. So you basically have placeholders, variable placeholders in your templates, which should be actually passed and replaced with the values that you need to have in the final file. And lastly, read and write SSH client. So you can, read and SSH client. So you can either rely on your default SSH installation or Paramiko and PyCrypto, which are both Python SSH client libraries. So on the managed node, all you need is an SSH server, Python 2, Python simple JSON to run in Python less than Python 2.5. I understand that Python 2.4 doesn't have JSON implementation. Correct me if I'm wrong. And if you have SE that's implemented on your managed node, then you need Python bindings for that in order to use the file copying functions and so components. So when you install your Ansible setup on your client, you usually get a few tools and modules. Modules is what we call the module library. Collectively to module library. So we start with Ansible, which is the first app, the executable. This is what you use to execute iHub commands when you want to test something without writing any playbooks or scripts or that. I'll get to that in a minute. Next, we have playbooks, which is a tool that you use to perform batch processes. Let's say you had 1,000 web servers and database servers and the like. You don't go executing out commands. You actually specify what you want in your playbooks and execute those. And have the stage reflect on your playbooks reflected on the server. So, next, we have Ansible Pool, which is Ansible's implementation of decentralization, where you have your managed node pooling playbooks and configuration file and everything onto itself and actually executing those, sort of like a bootstrap process. Next, we have Ansible Doc, which is like, which I would say is sort of like your Ansible's version of, I don't know, maybe a man-page reader or something, viewer. So that's how you use to do your Ansible implementation. And Ansible Galaxy, which is, it kind of means internet things, but in this context, the tool is sort of like apt or YAM for Ansible. This is what you use to download and install packages from Ansible's collection of community contributed scripts. So let's say if I would write something that Ansible doesn't have, and I would like to share that with other Ansible DevOps. I basically write my own and deploy that to Ansible Galaxy, which is also a service, and have other DevOps download that and implement and contribute back also. So yes, this is actually part of management for community contributed Ansible stuff. Okay, so the other thing that we have once you install Ansible is modules. This is the module library I was talking about previously. This is a collection of components that do the work, that do the real job to the managed nodes. They do things to the managed nodes. So I have a few examples here of modules that are used. So we have the ping module. This is not a ping that we know. This is basically a command used by Ansible to check whether the managed nodes are available and ready to receive commands. So if you want to know our web server is available and ready to be, to have it configured the state that we'd like, we'd first check whether it's available, and I'll show you the output of that command later. So we have command which allows you to execute a raw SSH command on the managed node. And this is just, it's more like SSHing directly to there and executing a batch, a shell script, a shell statement. And you have the app command that it's basically used to manage apps on the managed node. So app get installed, you would use that, but not in the same syntax. And here we have OSX speak. So you had a mark somewhere here. That's our managed node. We'll actually use this module to make the mark speak. So, right. Okay, so we come to installation down. On Ubuntu, you'd like to add Ansible's PPM repository. Ubuntu also has it in its own repositories, but they tend to lag the end version. You get the latest version of the latest features there, and you basically out the update. So now, one of the more better ways of installing Python related stuff is using pip. And the good thing about pip is that you can use pip. You can actually isolate your installation into a virtual, which is what it's called, a virtual isolated container, where you install all your Python dependencies independent of what the system has. And I won't get the details of that, but basically that's the syntax of installing after you set up your Python environment. You don't even notice there's no sudo. So, and then there's also Git. You can clone and get the latest bleeding edge features and code and everything Ansible related from Git to Python. Basically that's how you set it up. So, so we'll talk about inventory. So before we go into that, inventory is what Ansible uses to. This is how you tell Ansible what servers, what managed nodes are available for use as target machines. You basically specify an IP address and a host name and group them in your inventory, and that will be available to Ansible. So that's sort of like Ansible's database of hosts. That's what it will use to know basically where it wants to deploy stuff. So there are basically three types of inventory. One is just basically a flat file, and I have an example format of our inventory, flat file inventory here. This is basically ini format. This is what is used on most Windows apps, legacy apps, I guess. Depends on what ini, but it can end basically. So you have your website, your servers defined at the top, your managed nodes defined at the top, and at the bottom you have groups. So we basically grouped all these into our web servers groups so that we can basically facilitate executing commands on all two without specifying which web server, without specifying both. Yes, so that's the first method of specifying your inventory. The second method is to use a directory. So here we have a mock directory structure of our inventory. So basically, instead of having a file of inventory, we now have a directory. And just like I mentioned earlier, as I showed you earlier, grouping your hosts into ini formatted groups, you can have them as individual files, or even subsequent folders inside the root directory, the root inventory directory. So the leaves of these are actually files, and they basically have IP addresses of the nodes that you want to deploy to. We come more to the advantages of grouping them like that later. So now, the third is to have executable anything. Executable shell script, Python file, JavaScript file, Node, compile application, binary file. Basically, we want to do this because we like to generate dynamic inventory database based on real world conditions, like the weather, availability of nodes, nodes that are closest to the data center. Yeah, maybe if you believe that you're being DOSed at one of the data centers for some reason, you can have a script check loads on the data center and ignore those and deploy elsewhere fast before you come to the. So, running Ansible. So basically, I have two methods of running, not two, but three. Three methods of running Ansible. And the first is add of commands. This is basically where you just type a one-off command and have that run. And have a few instances deployed. So it's basically a one-liner. So I have the first example here, the ping command that I showed you earlier. So basically I call Ansible, which is the first tool that we spoke about earlier also. All is a keyword used to tell Ansible that you want to target all managed nodes that you have in your inventory, regardless of purpose. And the M is the parameter -m ping is actually the specified the module there. So this is the expected output result if you have if there was a success. Basically, you have the first line, like I said, all hosts. Then the first host, the second host success. Changed means change is actually the key that you check if you want to know whether there was a change in state made to the server. So ping doesn't do anything, doesn't install anything, doesn't copy any files to the managed node. All it does is just check whether the managed node is available. So changed. This is a play record. This is what Ansible tells you after you execute a command or a play. The resultant state of your managed node. So this is the reply ping pong. It's basically not the thing that will come to that. Right? So this is the second example, more useful example. So you remember earlier we had grouped our web servers into both our web servers into the web servers, web server 1 and web server 2. So if you execute this out of command, you basically want to install Nginx. Nginx is it's like it's an alternate Apache. I'm going to do it Nginx, but it's a web server. So you can see we have a raw command that you otherwise type at the shell. And that's basically the parameter passed to the the command module. The command module is similar things to the ping module, it's somewhat an Ansible module, but it's more practical. You actually execute raw SSH commands. So you can basically skip, if you skip the M command or you don't pass any commands to Ansible, it will assume that you want to work with this module, the command module. And, so the third example, so basically, some of you are familiar with Ansible. You object to this. This is not how you actually get to do stuff, and I agree. This is not how you install stuff on your managed nodes. It's basically a more efficient way of doing this, and that's the syntax of the more efficient way using the apt module. So here again we target our web servers and we say we want both of them to have Nginx. And the module we want to use is apt, and the parameter we're passing is the package and the state that we want the command to be in. So that's the package is Nginx and the state is the latest. So basically what will happen is without typing a lot of raw SSH commands, it will go out of its way to make sure that it's updated its app cache and delete the state and try its best to get the latest version of Nginx from the repositories that are configured. And here's a sample result that we get. You see that change is true in this case because the state of the server has been changed. There's a new package that's been installed in Nginx, and the server is not the same as it was before the execution of this command. So we'll get to something called the Importancy. Basically, the Importancy is another big word. And the Importancy is basically the important operation is one that has no effect regardless of how many, has the same effect if you executed it once and multiple times thereafter, and the effect will still be the same. Okay. So let's say we executed this command afresh after we've done it this time. The state of the server will not be changed. The result will be different from this. In this case, if it's changed, will be false, and that's basically the importance. You can run this command till come and change. There will be no subsequent change to the state of the management. Right? So let's say we added a third web server to our inventory, and to the same group again. And we run the same command. This is what we would expect. The first two, since they had Nginx initially, after the first command, and we run it again, and we have the third server not having Nginx prior to this command. This is the expected output that we get. The third server will be changed, the first two did not. And that's basically the potency in action. So that's the end of the first. That's the end of expanding the first tool. How you run Ansible. That's the iHub commands. So we get to we talk about playbooks now. And playbooks are basically, let's say you have to do a lot on one server. That would be tedious if you have to execute your command multiple times. Let's say install Nginx, install MySQL, copy my site configuration to Nginx, copy a custom configuration to Nginx, maybe add some proxies or balancing. Doing all that via SSH or via other commands is going to be tedious. Basically, on the control link. So it's basically a lot of stuff. I would say running the following would be tedious and difficult, especially if it's part of a larger set of configuration commands that you need to do on your deployment on your managed nodes. Right? Okay. So playbooks are a collection of a sequence of Ansible tasks that you would like to be executed on your managed nodes. So they basically allow the use of variables. And they allow the use of handlers to be triggered after a certain change has occurred. Like let's say you copy the site configuration to Nginx, and you'd like Nginx to be restarted immediately thereafter. You can have sort of like an event listener handler to take care of that immediately after that has happened. So they're basically written in YAML, and you can have them as templates. And use variables that GTL basically can take care of the template, and use variables that Ansible avails. So this is an example playbook. It's basically a YAML dictionary. So this is here I'm basically executing the same. I'm trying to get the same job done, same task done that I had done with the previous three commands that I had shown earlier. So we have our hosts, which are the web servers. So Ansible will assume how to deploy to all my web servers in the web servers group. And I'd like this command to be executed as root or super user. And I have a list of tasks that I'd like to be done in sequence. So the first is to install Nginx and make sure it's present. Second is to deploy my site configuration. to Nginx's sites enabled folder, so that will be available. The third is to restart Nginx. Basically, execute this as shown on screen. So this is the expected output. Since my window is small, we need to scroll a bit in order to see what we. So I'll start at the top. Ansible will tell you what play is going on. It will tell you that it's executing this on web servers. You gather facts. So facts here, we'll just talk about facts. Facts are basically variables containing information gathered on managed nodes. An example of this would be the IP address, the host name, number of partitions, partition names, DevSDA, DevSDX, and what have you. The routes to the internet that the host has. And so you gather facts and you return OK when it's successful. Failure, otherwise, if the task was critical, it would stop there. But in this case, everything went as planned. So the next is, as you can see, the three tasks that were in the playbooks are executed in series. And
Up? There's no. Oh.
So I forgot to tell you about, going to detail about the tasks that we have lined up. So the name is, the name of the task is used, in my experience I've seen this used twice. The first is used to display what it's doing to investigate the out. And the second, it's like a function and it may be used as a, it's what is used to reference the task itself. So let's say something changed, an event changed, and want that task to be called when an event has changed, something like restarting Nginx, then you give that the name of that task. Then. So I'll come to that. I'll come to the details of that later. So the other name displayed there, which is the first use case of the task name. Then we have again the Importancy. If the web server 1 had stuff changed, web server 1 had Nginx prior, and its state was reflected in the playbook that we had, nothing would happen to it. In this case, web server 1 had state was consistent with the playbook, and in this case also web server 2 state was not consistent with what happened in the playbook. So Ansible will tell you that that is changed. Nginx was not installed prior to this command. So the next is to copy my site conf that will change and restart Nginx. So we scroll down that way. Okay. So now that when the playbook is over, we have a play recap. And the first column tells you that all tasks are executed okay. Okay, the number of tasks that executed okay without any glitches, ran as expected and desired. Change will tell you the number of things that changed. So with the web server 1, remember Nginx was installed, everything was okay. So it's that. So change is the last two things that executed on web server 1. Unreachable will be flagged 1 if the server could not be reached, and fail is basically fail. None of this will execute and it will display there. So that's the play.
Right? Or done?
Back again. Yeah, so I was going to talk about handlers later. So this is a playbook with handlers. So it's just sort of like a remix of what we had done here. So we have installed Nginx called my site conf, but notice that there is an additional third line on the second task, and that's the notify parameter. So basically it tells Ansible to restart Nginx immediately the previous line executes. That's if the my site conf was copied there. You'd like Nginx to restart and implement what you have in my site conf. So you'd like this to happen immediately. That happens before any of the other tasks occur. You may have a separate handler which I've defined at the bottom there. And that's the second use of the name parameter. That's how you give names to tasks. And that's how they will be referred to by other tasks as shown here. So yes, then afterwards, just to make sure Nginx is running, I'll actually execute the package. So we'll talk about templates. Templates are a bit different from playbooks. They can also be the same as playbooks. Again, if you're familiar with Django, you notice that you write your the templates usually have placeholders and maybe minimal programming like features, loops inside. And these get replaced once they're processed by the templating engine. So Ansible uses the Ginger templating engine. And just like I said earlier, Ginger gives DevOps minimal programming like features in their files. So one example that we use, or one instance that you use Ginger in your, sorry, not Ginger, yeah, so templates, is when you're copying, like, for example, the file that we're copying previously, my site conf, you'd have variable placeholders inside. This is an example of a template. So this is an example of my site configuration that's used by Nginx for sites available sites. So basically, have just to the right of server, we have our first variable placeholder. So I could have defined this in an inventory file, proxy service, and I'd have an IP address or a host name where that variable is. And we'll come to the next server listen port. I'd have a port there where Nginx would listen, and a redirect rule and location for proxying any requests that have that URL in them. So when this is processed by Ginger, it will basically replace, when it's processed by Ansible itself, it will basically replace all these variables with the values that I had defined in various inventory files or other data sources. So that ends with Ansible tools and Ansible playbook tools. So we have the third tool that I'm going to talk about today. This is the Ansible pull module. And what happens is with push modules, you basically have a central control loop that SSHs and connects to all your managed nodes and deploys or makes sure that the state is consistent with what you have in your playbooks or in command. So that doesn't scale very well. If you are to try and connect to more than 1,000 managed nodes, even manual through SSH, you find that you get a bit of bottleneck. You find the bottlenecks along the way. And another reason why you wouldn't want to use Ansible in push mode is if you have many hosts and one of them goes off and they miss their chance at configuration, and they won't get configured and their state will be inconsistent with what you desire. So, and also that, lastly, with Ansible pull, what we do is decentralize execution of Ansible from one node to all the managed nodes. So basically what will happen is you can have a cron job running on your Ansible, on your managed nodes, and have them pull your playbooks on themselves and execute those locally, sort of like bootstrap. And yes, that's the end of this presentation.